Um, I want to start today with a poem that is sort of scripture, but sort of not. It's a little different kind of thing. There's a collection, part of the Pali Canon. There's a collection called the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is a collection of kind of short texts that all got put together. Um, and one of those is something called the Therigatha, which is a collection of poems by early female monastic followers of the Buddha. And this one is by, tradition says, Pyankasta Patakara is the name of the nun who wrote this. My son, you weep for one whose path you do not really comprehend, whether he's coming or going. From where has that son of yours come? And yet, for one whose path you know, for him you do not grieve at all, whether he's coming or going. Such is the nature of creatures. Uninvited, he came from there. Unpermitted, he's gone from here. And having come from who knows where, he lived but for a few short days. But though gone from here by one path, he goes from there by another. Departed with a human form, he will go flowing on and on. As he has come, so has he gone. What is there here to grieve about? My thorn indeed has been removed, buried in the heart so hard to see. That grief which had overcome me, grief for my son, has been dispelled. Today the thorn has been removed. Without hunger, I've become quenched. To Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, I go to the sage for refuge. I know it may seem a little out of place here on the cusp of summer, but what I want to talk about today is grief and mourning and how our Buddhist tradition provides both a container for our grief and tools that we can use to survive it, to manage it better. Here in America, there are three holidays this time of the year. The obvious one is Memorial Day, the day that we set aside to remember and venerate those who've sacrificed themselves on the altar of our nation. I think it goes without saying that grief is aroused by this holiday, especially for those of us who've personally lost a veteran, whether in war or thereafter. And our culture has a number of traditions that are intended to focus and express that grief at a national level or a local level, maybe parades, ceremonies, many focused on the flag, this sort of thing. The other holidays, Mother's Day was a few weeks ago, right? And Father's Day is coming up this next weekend. Presumably for most people and most families, those are happy events. But for those of us for whom one or both of our parents have died, these holidays can be occasions of grief, obviously. One of our Belmont Zen Center Sangha members' mother died last fall, and we had a memorial service for her uh, shortly before Christmas. The family's Catholic; they had a very nice Catholic funeral for her, but we did a memorial service for our member later. Um, I got up on Mother's Day morning. I woke up thinking about her. Um, and then I went on Facebook and saw that she actually posted, "This is my first Mother's Day without my mother." Um, from now on, for the rest of her life, as a mother herself, Mother's Day is going to be happy, but it's also going to be poignant, right? Her daughters, she has two daughters, her daughters will be celebrating her, but obviously she's going to miss her own mom. On Mother's Day, on her mother's birthday, on her wedding anniversary, on the day of her mother's death, the day of her mother's funeral. There's going to be recollection that will go with those, and there's going to be some grief that's going to come with that. Obviously, we carry grief with us for everyone we've lost. It's always there. Sometimes it intensifies depending on the situation, the context, the time of the year. We may also have a degree of anticipatory grief for loved ones who are still with us, but whose death we're anticipating, dreading, maybe a little bit. Maybe that's the right word. My mother, I almost lost my mother 11 years ago. She was very, very ill. She came very close to death. I spent a few days unsure if she was going to pull through, and there was anticipatory grief. That was a really powerful part of that experience, very potent, and that's a feeling that lingers because now her mortality, which I always obviously knew about, but it became more salient. It became sharper because of that experience. So it's always there a little bit. We may also have a kind of anticipatory grief for ourselves, not so much about ourselves, more so for all the loved ones from whom we will be separated. I think about my wife, my kids, my grandkids. There's an ache that comes along with thinking about the idea that they will be grieving someday for me, potentially, definitely, unavoidably. Because the undeniable reality is we are mortal beings surrounded by mortal beings. And because of that, grief and mourning are unavoidable. I know this song is very aware of that fact. You're anticipating the opportunity to celebrate the life and mourn the loss of your friend Shinyo in a few weeks here, Mickey. As long as we live, grief is our job. But it's important to understand that sometimes it's our full-time job, but sometimes it's our part-time job. It can't be our full-time job all the time. There's a word for that. There's a term for that. Anybody who's familiar with psychology, psychiatry, counseling, it recently got added to the Bible of the mental health field. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual now includes a diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder. The idea that making grief your full-time job for years and years and years is not healthy. When the death of someone we care about is fresh, grief is our full-time job. I think it's appropriate that grief is our full-time job. Our minds are preoccupied with thoughts, memories about that person. Our to-do list may be full of obligations that have to do with that person, a funeral to plan, maybe to figure out how to pay for, forms to fill out, friends and distant relatives to notify, lawyers and banks and government agencies to deal with, all the red tape of it. Grief can also be seasonal work, right? To keep up the job metaphor, sometimes it's seasonal work. Remembering a loved one on the important anniversaries of their life predictably comes every year, as I was talking about Mother's Day here earlier. Some of you know I've talked about it before. I have three grandsons, but no, I have two grandsons. I had three grandsons. I had a grandson in South Korea who only lived for 5 days. So every year, March 27th, April 1st, that's seasonal work. I remember this child, this theoretical child whom I never met. I pray for him. I dedicate the merit of my practice to this child. I take it as the spiritual duty of caring for this departed child as my work for those 5 days. There's an unspoken arrangement with the parents, with my son and my daughter-in-law. They take care on a daily basis of the two, and I worry about the one. We're not alone in this work. We have resources, right, that we can draw on. We have people we can talk to. We have traditions that we can lean on to manage that with less pain. And the important point I want to make this morning is as adopted children of this Korean Son tradition. I'm looking around the room here. None of us grew up directly, at least, in this Korean Son tradition. But as adopted children of this Korean Son lineage, the traditions and practices that have come down to us as part of our spiritual inheritance provide us with some tools that we can use to work with our grief and a therapeutic environment in which we can do that. My impression is that here in America, many cultural traditions that used to guide people through the process of grief have kind of faded out. A lot of them have gotten lost completely, and in actually pretty short order, just a couple of generations. Things that used to be an important aspects of the way the community would come together and people would support each other, and traditions, cultural traditions, have sort of been abandoned or faded away or forgotten about. My ancestors are hillbillies way back, right? I grew up in southern West Virginia. My mama was born in a coal camp. Hillbillies way back, both sides, Kentucky, West Virginia. Not Hatfields and McCoys, but pretty damn close. And there are mourning rituals that used to be really common in my hillbilly ancestors that I've heard stories about, but I'd never experienced because they were things that had already kind of faded or been abandoned before I came along. For example, my mom still talks about how she and one of my uncles, her brother-in-law, sat up all night with my father's coffin open in the living room of the house, right? They went to the funeral home and they prepared the body and they got it in the casket, but then they brought the coffin to my grandparents' house, which just had like a little bridge over a creek. I don't know how the hell they got a coffin over that little tiny, didn't even have handrails on the sides, but they got a coffin into the living room. And my mom and my uncle, not a child of the man who died, a son-in-law of the man who died, sat up all night next to the open coffin as people from the community came and went all night long, bringing food to the house for next morning really early. They took the coffin up the hills, up the mountainside to the cemetery up on the side of the mountain overlooking the holler, right, to bury him, and then came back to the house for a meal that fed the whole community and had lots and lots of food left over. I'm sure that's a way of mourning I never experienced. I went to lots of funerals in Kentucky up on that mountain, but that was something that was gone. A lot of those traditions had already fallen by the wayside. If you think about this metaphor I'm working on here of grief as work, grief as a job, then an obvious question is, how long after the death of a loved one should grief be our full-time job? I think this is an area where we've definitely lost something in our modern capitalist work-obsessed culture. For example, Hedison had mentioned earlier, I work for Ohio University. My employer gives contract staff employees a maximum of 3 days of bereavement leave, limited to the death of a loved one who meets a pretty narrow definition of immediate family. And outside of that, you don't get any leave at all. 3 days certainly isn't enough time to even deal with the practical logistics when somebody dies, much less start to like process the loss or work on grief or anything. By comparison, in the Korean tradition that's adopted us, the Chondoje provides a timeline that's very humane. For the first 49 days, as the tradition teaches that our loved one is in the intermediate time between one life and the next, grief is clearly the full-time job. And there's space allowed for that. There is a memorial service in this tradition every 7 days, culminating in what's called the 49-day ceremony, right? Which is a memorial service, but like on a much bigger scale, right? So that 49-day period, grief is your full-time job. And then at the end of that 49-day period, it's not anymore. On their face, these rituals are performed for the benefit of the deceased, right? To help guide them to a better birth, such as in Amitabh's Western paradise. But clearly, this series of ceremonial actions benefits those who mourn as well. We're given a sense of control. We have a feeling that we can still help this person whom we cared about. We can still help our loved one that we've lost. If nothing else, it keeps us occupied. It gives us something to do rather than allowing us to simply kind of fall down and wallow in our grief. We have stuff to do. We have things to keep us busy, if nothing else. I found an academic paper that a couple of researchers wrote about the 49-day ceremony and its function. Hyun Gong Moon and Brian D. Summers, they made kind of the same point. So this is a quote from their academic paper. Firstly, the ceremony functions as a send-off for the deceased, ensuring their place in the Pure Land. Second, the ceremony acts as a means of spiritual and psychological comfort for the survivors. Through the 49-day ceremony rituals, the departed spirit is purified through various stages consisting of various mantras and Buddhist texts, offered food, and guided to the Pure Land through the power of the blessings of the Buddha, bodhisattvas, and guardian deities. However, these various procedures also serve as an important means of connection for surviving family members, not only as they take time to say goodbye to the departed, but as an opportunity to cultivate meaningful relationships among themselves. Another thing they stress in this paper in particular is how the rituals of this process, the Jeondoje, give the bereaved the opportunity to work through any feelings of regret, injustice, guilt, ambivalence that they may have still kind of be holding on to in association with the person who's died, or the how they died, or why they died, when they died. Helping that person who has died to pass on to a better rebirth by easing their bad karma provides a source of comfort for the people who are left behind. The opportunity can provide solace to those people who are grieving. It provides this is the way they put it in the paper, a psychological and emotional buffer for bereaved families who've lost a loved one. Especially since an important part of the traditional ceremonies in this 49-day process involve using language that's addressed explicitly to the person who's died. You're talking to that person. The priest who's leading the ceremony is delivering spiritual teachings to that person to help them, to help guide them. They're addressed explicitly to the person who's died. That gives the mourners the opportunity to communicate directly with their loved one. When we look around the world, when we look in different cultures, this is something people need. This is something people crave. I wish I had another chance to talk to that person. Well, you can. In the context of these rituals, you're talking to that person, you're addressing their needs, their well-being. The authors of this paper go on to point out that an absence of funeral and mourning rituals that provide these kinds of opportunities has become a problem in Korean Protestant communities. They don't, it's 3 days, and then go back to work, right? It's that sort of thing. And they don't feel like they have that kind of opportunity. In fact, they point out that in lots of Catholic churches in South Korea, there's a tradition that's actually developed of having a funeral mass, a Catholic funeral mass, on the 49th day. Even though the 49-day period has no significance in Catholic doctrine or dogma or understanding, but it's such an important part of Korean culture. Korean Catholics feel like they need something. And so doing a funeral mass, I don't know if maybe they do a funeral mass, shortly after the person's died, but then they do another one on the 49th day afterwards. It's also apparently become really common when there are national tragedies in South Korea. There was a big ferry accident a couple of years ago, as you may have heard about. Um, there was a disaster in Seoul a couple of years ago where just kind of a mob crush and a couple hundred people died just sort of getting stomped on in it. It was some holiday, bad traffic control problems. It's apparently become really common to have sort of national level 49-day ceremonies after those kinds of things to give the whole country a chance to grieve. So, compared to the anemic funeral traditions that we're kind of left with in American culture, which don't seem like a lot of time and labor to do, mostly we're paying professionals to do them for us. It might be tempting to view 49 days of weekly rituals as a lot of bother, a lot of effort, a lot of time to put into something. Uh, I hope I've dissuaded you of thinking that way. I think this is a positive thing. Regardless of whether you believe these rituals hold any benefit for the loved one you've lost, these rituals provide you, as the person who's left behind, the opportunity to do that kind of deep, full-time job of grieving with an intensity and a focus that's beneficial, to work through stuff, to not just sort of let things fester. And metaphorically, think about these 49 days as an opportunity to have kind of a hot, intense fire that burns away the underbrush of from our relationship with that person who's died, and what's left behind is kind of a clear forest, right? Rather than having sort of a choked and smoldering fire that could go on for years, for a long time. So after the intense experience of this full-time work, we're better prepared for the part-time job of continuing to grieve and mourn that person in a different way through the first year, right? As we continue to remember that person as a focus of our practice. And then following that, the seasonal work of years to come as we commemorate that person on their life anniversaries, right? On their birthday, on the day that they died, on Mother's Day, on Father's Day, on those kinds of occasions. Um, I think the 49-day ceremonies, going through that process, can help us to reach a more hopeful resolution so that those later experiences are more, they're, the word I used earlier, they're poignant, but they're positive, right? We can remember the person. We can have pleasant memories of that person. We can have pleasant feelings that we associate with that person rather than the lingering negative that we've sort of been more able to work through. Sunbol Hashipshio, may you and all beings manifest enlightenment.